Welcome to the Principal's Perspective, where we explore what it really takes to lead a school and why great leadership is a way of being and a set of skills that can be learned. I'm Dr. Adrian Camm.
And I'm Teagan Collins. Whether you're leading a school, an organisation, or preparing for your next leadership move, we're here to break down the strategies, challenges, and real-life moments that define leadership today.
This podcast is your guide to navigating leadership with clarity, confidence, and impact.
Let's get into today's episode.
Hi, Teagan.
Hi, Adrian.
Great to see you again.
Lovely to be here.
We're here for another episode of the Principal's Perspective, and today we're going to be talking about pathways to principalship. What are some of the things we're going to be talking about?
We'll be talking about what does it really mean to be a principal, and I'm really looking forward to delving into your experience here. The shift from an executive leadership position into that first role or your first position as a principal. We'll do a little bit of self-reflection on, are we ready for principalship? How do we ever know? Also thinking about our leadership vision, what our vision may be when we're principal or for you as a principal, and then how we prepare for the application and interview process. And hopefully we'll get into also the reflections of when you do obtain that inaugural principalship, how you then go about doing all the things you said you were going to do. And we'll get into all of those conversations very shortly.
Sounds great.
What have I missed?
I don't know. Where do we start?
We can start by talking about what it really means to be a principal and why principalship. I'm interested in hearing from you and how you define what it means to be a principal.
Being a principal is one of the best jobs in the world with some of the hardest days, as we've talked about before. But it's an honour and a privilege to lead a community. You're talking about the growth and development of young people and the trust that families place in you. And so you feel that pressure. And so for me, I think being a principal, you're acutely aware of those pressures. But it is a fantastic job. It's a job that we should be encouraging more people to look at. And I know, Teagan, that you and I have spoken in previous years about when we hear experienced principals speak about their journey, about their pathway, sometimes it can be a little bit deflating when the narrative or the message is they just fell into it. It wasn't what they really set out to do, but they just sort of landed. It wasn't intentional. And for some, that's fine. That's how it works. But for others, it can be a career focus. It can be that's the goal that they're aiming for. And we should be encouraging more of our young leaders, our aspirant leaders, to step into the principal role because it's a fantastic job.
Absolutely, Adrian, I couldn't agree more. We need aspirant leaders to be putting out there and naming that they would love to be a principal one day. Our next generation of leaders, where do they exist? Where is the pipeline of principals? We need to be putting out there when I am a principal, or how do I get there because I want to be a principal? And you and I have these conversations with our colleagues and aspirant principals that we've identified as part of our Emerging Leaders program and our high potential leaders is when you are a principal one day, how will you manage that?
And I love that, when you are a principal one day. That's focusing in on when it's going to happen, not if. And I can understand some of the hesitancy around people aspiring to become a principal with the negative media rhetoric around schools and teachers. And so it's incumbent upon us to continue to share the positive stories, to create positive news about schools, the work that goes on within them, the principals that lead those schools. So we are encouraging more and more people to step into those roles. And as I like to say, ambition is not a dirty word. So let's cultivate the talent, the aspiring principals, the aspiring leaders we have in our schools, and let's encourage them and support them on their journey to become principals themselves.
That's a really nice segue into talking about how do you know when you're ready for principalship? At what point do you bite the bullet and say, I'm now going to start looking for positions? How do you even get to that point?
I don't think you're ever ready. I think if you're waiting until you're ready, you're waiting for too long. You might be waiting forever, in fact, because you're never ready. Life involves continuous learning, and that's the same for being a leader in a school. So if you're waiting until you've got it all figured out, that's never going to happen. So I think it's more recognising that at a moment in time, through some deep self-reflection, you feel as though you can take that next step. You might not be confident, but you should have some ambition and you should have some drive to go into a process and start considering what it might look like for you to lead a school. So I don't think you're ever ready. You should never wait until you're ready, and you should be moving forward with confidence that you can do the job. From my own personal experiences, Teagan, I think I decided that I wanted to become a principal when I saw principals who weren't doing a particularly good job. But I've had some great principals and I've seen some great leaders in schools, and I've admired them and I've learnt a lot from them. But I've also learnt a lot from those whose leadership style and philosophy didn't resonate with me. And so about 7 or 8 years ago, a light bulb went off for me. It's like, I could lead a school. Now, at the time, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But I started deliberately working on the gaps that I had in my knowledge and my experience, and systematically becoming the leader that I both wanted to be and needed to be.
I just want to go back to your point around you're never truly ready, but there are some things that we can do and control that principals need. And we talk about things like governance experience or training, expertise in areas of finance, particularly, of course, honing your leadership skills and working with people, identifying what areas and gaps in terms of a skill matrix that you may be missing and need to contribute to. I should have led with outstanding teaching and learning expertise and knowledge, being a school as our core business.
It's a really good point to reflect on. I think you definitely need that deep expertise in a particular area, but you also need breadth across the broad range of leadership roles that are in schools. And so you need to engage in that self-reflection and to look critically at what you're missing. What are my strengths and what am I missing? Now, oftentimes you don't know what you're missing until you're in a role like this, and then you're figuring it out on the go. And that's fine. Experiential learning, right? It's something that happens every day in the office of a principal. You're always coming across a situation that you've never encountered before. And so you do need to be that lead learner. You're modelling lifelong learning for everybody. But if we talk about pathways to principalship, I think there's the traditional pathway, Teagan, which we probably saw 10, 15, 20 years ago, which was you would take a pastoral route through your leadership journey. You might be a head of house, you might be a director of year level, you might step into a deputy head of school role, and then typically a head of senior school role, which would then set you up to deputy principal, which would then set you up to principal. It was fairly hierarchical. It was pretty much you take one step up the ladder and then you eventually get to where you needed to be. Now, that took time. Particularly if we look historically, it was frowned upon if you jumped roles and schools too often. People would be asking questions. Well, how come you only spent 2 years here? How come you only spent 3 years in that role? But it's changed a little. There is still that traditional pathway to principalship, but we're also seeing different pathways. We're seeing people who are skipping some levels on that ladder, and we're seeing, say, a director of teaching and learning going straight into a principal role without having done a deputy principal role first. So that's an interesting time and an interesting space for schools to navigate, because I think having expertise in managing the teaching and learning and curriculum and assessment of a school is one thing, but having no experience in dealing with difficult parents and the pastoral side of leadership and risk and finance is another. And so I think there's pros and cons in terms of which pathway people take, but both are really valid pathways now. But to answer your question, you need to start identifying at a fairly early stage what are your gaps in your understanding and knowledge of school leadership. And for most, that is school finances. Other gaps that typically are apparent is governance understanding. That can be learned through courses like the AICD Company Directors course, but you never truly understand it until you're in it and working with a board of directors and navigating different personalities and skill sets. Hopefully you don't have to, but politics in relation to board dynamics and also their relationship with the principal and the executive team. And of course, that age-old delineation between governance and operations. And so it's something that you continually learn as you go. But the earlier you can identify things that you know almost nothing about and start developing a baseline understanding of those things, it's going to hold you in good stead when you start preparing your application for your first principalship.
And some practicalities of that are things like getting yourself on a not-for-profit board or a not-for-profit subcommittee, or having experience as a director in different settings so that you can experience it from the other side of the table.
Totally. And also, if you're an executive member already and you're starting to think about principalship, ask the principal, can I come along to a finance and property subcommittee? Can I shadow you for half a day? Can I come along to a board meeting as an observer? Constantly showing the initiative and looking for ways to broaden your experiences is only going to hold you in a positive light for when you are applying for those roles.
The other thing that we talk about is also having the postgraduate qualifications and academic prowess to support your application when you're going for that role as principal in leading schools. That's something that we need to really role model. And I know we throw around or bandy the term lifelong learning, but I firmly believe we really need to embody that stepping into the role of principal. How do you feel about that?
I agree with you. I think we're seeing academic inflation. Once upon a time, postgraduate qualifications for leaders in schools was a nice to have. It would be considered favourably. But now I think it's almost a necessity. A master's level education is almost replacing an undergraduate degree. That becomes our new ceiling. And as we're seeing, many are then extending their postgraduate studies into doctorates or PhDs or MBAs, all of which are legitimate academic pathways for school principals.
So we've talked about, are we ready? We've got our CV ready to go. We're ready to take that jump. No time's ever a good time, as you always remind me. Family's never going to be perfect. Life's never going to be perfect in terms of it's never going to be the perfect time. So just do it.
Just do it. You think like tomorrow or next week you're going to find more time or life's going to be more simpler. It's not. So just do it.
So we're just doing it.
You're right.
We're going to apply. The conversation then becomes what type of school or what schools might be on our list, what aligns, perhaps the denomination of the school, single sex, coeducational, prep to 12 combined and or primary, secondary. And then there's also questions around geographics, location, structure of the board, chair of the board. What other types of things were you considering when you were looking at applying for your first principalship?
Life phase and career stage comes into the equation. There's only so many schools and so many principal jobs in Australia. How badly do you want it? What sacrifices are you willing to make? And are you willing to move? Now, that's a simple thing if you're a single person, or perhaps even if you've got a partner and you both agree that for the right job, you'd be willing to change state or move house. But when you've got children, that definitely becomes a complicating factor. But that's not to say it can't be done. People do it all the time, but it's just something else to consider when you're starting to prepare for your first principalship. You talked about all the different types of schools that you need to be looking at. For me, the fundamental thing that you need to consider is, are you aligned philosophically with that school that you're looking at applying for to become the principal? There's no point applying for a job if you believe that explicit and direct instruction is the only teaching and learning approach, and yet the school that you're applying for has a history of progressive education and is all about inquiry. That's a mismatch, unless the board is specifically looking for a principal to come in and turn the ship around and change direction. You've got to think about those sort of things. What's the reputation of the school? What's the size of the school? The faith affiliation definitely plays a part. If a school is an Anglican school and it is Sydney Anglican, let's say, so it's quite a religious school, there's religious education classes, there's chapel, there's a chaplaincy program, and you're an atheist, well, that's not going to work. It might, once again, because everything depends, but these are all the sorts of things that you have to be considering, and they sound really common sense, but they're things that perhaps aren't initially on your radar when you start looking at these jobs.
One thing I'm interested in is the readiness or appetite of the board and the type of principal that they're looking for and how much that weighs into whether you apply or don't apply. So let's say all of those qualities from a school perspective align, but then there tends to be an agenda from board chairs and from recruiting firms and companies who generally lead these types of roles around the type of principal they're looking for. Has the previous principal been there for 20 years and they're looking for a fresh face, someone to come in, change, invigorate, renew? Are they looking for status quo and a steady pair of hands? Are they looking for a major strategic direction shifting, or perhaps they're underperforming from a financial perspective, and therefore then there's the questions about, do I really want to take this on, and how will this potentially look for me if it goes south? How much of that played into your thinking when you were applying for a principal role, and was that on your radar?
It was, and it is, and it continues to be, because we keep an eye on the landscape across the sector, across the country, and we're looking at constantly at who's going into what role, in what school, and where have they been before. That's just part and parcel of what we do. It's our network. But it definitely plays a part. And in my experience, what happens with schools is they typically go on a cycle. Now, I'm not saying this happens in every case, but in my experience, schools will typically look to bring in a steady pair of hands. Someone who's going to come in and be a steward in the true sense of the word, not try and change things too much, but just galvanise the community, consolidate on what's happening. And they might be there for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. That's another point. I think increasingly we won't see principals or heads being in the one school for that length of time in the future. I think probably 10 years is the absolute most. Understanding for our listeners that a typical principal contract is a 5-year contract, at which point, subject to good performance and board satisfaction, a new contract might be entered into. So typically I think your tenure is going to be capped at around 10 years in any one school. But going back to my original point, I think there's a cycle, and I don't think it's deliberate, but typically you get that safe pair of hands who's in the role for an extended period of time, then the board or the community might be looking for someone who's a bit more of a change agent or someone who's going to come in and do something a little bit different. And then it repeats.
I just want to pick up on what you were saying earlier around we're seeing younger principals step into the role. We're seeing shorter tenures than we ever had before. A lot of that post-COVID landscape changed things. When we see that coming out of ACU with the principal study around health and wellbeing and the longitudinal work they're doing around the top stresses of the role and how that manifests and what impact that may have on the profession. But as a result, we're seeing, particularly in hard-to-staff areas, and this is cross-sector, so it's government schools, Catholic schools and independent schools, more and more principals with less than 10 years experience in the headship role. Now, that means in your lifetime, you may reinvent yourself as a principal 3, 4, 5 times. That scares me. Does it scare you?
I plan meticulously and I'm always forward planning. What does the next 3 years, 5 years look like? Understanding that things change and you need to be adaptable and fluid and flexible and all those sorts of things. But yeah, it scares me. I think it scares me more now that I have young children because they start school, they start forming friendships, they start enjoying what they consider to be their world. And then potentially at some point in the future, we're going to have to say, sorry, we might have to move because of Dad's work. So that is a little bit scary. It does worry me a little bit. But I think you can't be too worried. I think you back yourself in, you know you're going to do a good job, you continue to do the best that you can be, and you just see what happens, not to overthink it too much.
The emotional demand and the emotional intensity of that rebuild is something that in adding on the family concerns, that's in the back of my mind is how you reinvigorate yourself.
We see a lot of principals and heads in independent schools in particular retire a little bit earlier than the national retirement age. They get to a point where they're emptied out. So we have to be really mindful of that when we talk about principalship, that we're balancing all the different competing demands and the principal needs to look after their own well-being. Yes, the ACU work is illuminating and really concerning. And I actually resonate with a lot of their findings and I empathise and sympathise, and that's some of my experience too. But at the end of the day, the way I look at it is despite the systemic structures, the structuring structures, the external accountabilities, the policies, the media rhetoric, it's incumbent upon us. We've got agency over ourselves and our schools, and so we have to challenge that and we have to say, no, it's okay for me to go for a swim at lunchtime. It's okay for me to finish early because I want to go and pick up my daughter from school, or whatever it is, however you be well as a principal, that's on us. And we can operate within the confines of the system we find ourselves in, but there is so much we can do within that system. And that's why a lot of the work over the past few years, Teagan, has been in our community really central around changing that notion of the principal being all things to all people at all times. Because if we don't change that narrative, then we're not going to see people aspiring to these roles, and rightfully so. So we have to, not just for ourselves and our schools and our communities, but for the next generation of leaders who are coming through.
I love that. Let's talk about preparing for the application and the interview. We've done all of our homework. We know that we're not ready, but we're going to throw our hat in the ring. We feel as though we've got everything behind us that we need.
Yep.
And we're going to start preparing for our application. We've got the job that we'd like to apply for.
Yep.
We've maybe even been in touch with the recruiter to let them know that we're managing up and letting them know that we're going to put an application in.
Yep.
Or they've been in touch with us.
Yes, it happens all the time.
Sometimes there may be some selection criteria that we need to answer as part of providing our cover letter along with our CV and perhaps the responses to those selection criteria. What's important to you?
You're telling your own story. You're selling yourself to someone you haven't met yet. We tend to undersell our accomplishments and our experiences. You can't let that get in the way of your application. You have to sell yourself without being arrogant. You have to draw a really close distinction between the use of I and we. The recruiter or the board wants to know what you've done, but they also want to understand that you're not a lone ranger and a wild innovator who just goes off and does things on their own. They want to know that you can work with teams and you can build teams and bring teams along with you. I also think you have to be really clear in terms of the schools that you've worked in, because there's this assumption sometimes that the board or the recruiter knows you and where you've come from. A good recruiter will do their homework, but the board might be looking at your application for the first time a couple of days before your interview, and they might know nothing about the school that you've currently been in. In my applications, I was always really explicit in terms of if I'd had a previous history in a different school, I'd put in a sentence or two to explain what that school was. Give them some context so that they're not making up their own story and they don't have to go away and do the research. The other tip that I would share, and I was guilty of this as well, is oftentimes when you're applying for your first principalship, you want to showcase everything you've done. And so you put too much in your application because you want it to all be there. Look at all this stuff I've done. It's all great. But you have to look at it really critically and make sure that you're only sharing what you think is going to really resonate with the board. I still laugh, Teagan, when we read applications for teaching jobs. And some people have their full employment history dating back to when they were the fruit and veg manager at Coles. And that's great, well done, but probably irrelevant for the job that they're applying for. So make sure that it's relevant, make sure that it's customised and tailored to that particular school. Make sure you're addressing your cover letter to the right person. Nothing is worse than something like a covering letter that says, "Dear hiring manager." Do the research, understand the school, weave their values, weave their language through your application to show that you're actually really interested and you're actually invested. You're not just going through the motion. There's so many other things that I could probably share, but there are a couple of key tips.
Really personalised and tailored. Building that leadership portfolio and evidence in terms of your portfolio is also really critical, and how you can speak to that. The initiatives that you have led, even if it was working with a team, it's how you position it, how do you evidence the success of that work, where is it connected into the school strategic plan, was it within your portfolio or outside of your portfolio, how do you influence change outside of your portfolio is really important when you're going for that first principalship, something that influences school life as a whole. If you're not the Director of Teaching and Learning, how are you influencing teaching and learning as an example? What key initiatives or strategic initiatives have you led and delivered on? And I think the other piece that can get missed is, okay, so you've initiated the change, great. We may provide some evidence, excellent. But what's happened to that 2, 3, 4 years later down the track? How can you prove the change implications or the change programs that you've initiated and that they're still successful?
I think you're 100% right. So it's about when you're articulating your achievements and your accomplishments and the things that you've led in your application, it's being really specific and looking at it from end to end. It's not good enough, for instance, to say, I led the creation of a new teaching and learning framework. Well done, but what did it do? So a better response would be, I collaboratively led the development of a teaching and learning framework that within 3 years led the school to achieving their best ATAR results in its history, which were X, Y, and Z. You've got to be specific. What did you do? How did you do it? Why did you do it? And what were the outcomes? And if you try and frame that through all the different accomplishments, it's going to be a much stronger application.
So we've got our application together, and it's been so excellent based on this podcast that we have successfully proceeded through to the interview phase. We likely, before we even submit an application, we would have had a conversation with the recruiter. That may be positioned as an informal interview or first steps. Yeah. Then we submit our application and big tick, we've progressed to that first stage. That could be with another round with the recruiter and a sub-panel, or it could be with the real panel. What was your experience?
Typically, you'd have another round with the recruiter, and it could include a few more people. What they do is they receive all their applications and they generate a long list. And then internally, they might start thinking about what a short list might look like. They might send the long list to the board for some early consideration, or they might go ahead and generate that shortlist themselves based on another round of interviews and then present that shortlist to the board. So typically 2 or 3 rounds with a recruiter is quite common at this level, and then you get in front of the board.
The real interview.
That's the real interview. Now, that can be different in different schools. Sometimes you might have the whole board on your interview panel, and that can be really daunting if you've got a board with 10 or 15 directors.
How many directors did you have?
I had the whole board on mine.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think there was 11 directors at the time, and so that was a little bit scary, but also a great opportunity. I think oftentimes you'll come in and you'll be quite nervous. That's natural.
It means you care, as we remind the students.
That's right. But you've got to have done your preparation. And that preparation extends, in my mind, to everything you can find out about each director on that panel. Because the common mistake is that you want to come across really academic, expert at what you do. And sometimes that can be a bit cold and clinical if you're not careful. And so you've got to approach panel interviews understanding that the panel, they're people too. And oftentimes you want to try and create the right environment by addressing them by name, by looking them in the eye, by knowing a little bit about their background and where they come from and what they do and how long they've been involved with the school, because you never know throughout the interview process when that information might be useful and you can build it into the conversation. Because hopefully it's a conversation, and the best interviews that I've been involved in are a conversation. And you always want to start preparing your responses to what you know would be, let's say, the 10 most common questions. You know, why do you want this job? Why should we hire you? What do you know about the school? Why this job right now? What 3 things would someone say about you? There are some really standard questions that find themselves in almost every interview. And you don't have to memorize and prepare responses to those questions, but you want to be prepared to be able to answer those questions well. And in my experience, the best methodology going into an interview and to frame in your own mind your responses as you're doing your preparation is the STAR methodology. It's not new. It's been around for a long time. S means situation or scenario. T means task or thinking. A means action. And R means result. So when you're starting to frame your responses to interview questions along those lines, it becomes really easy. What was the situation or scenario? What did I do, or what was I thinking at the time? What was the action, and then what were the results? And then you can extend it and say, what would I do differently, or what did I learn? And if you're framing your responses along those lines, you're incorporating personal stories, because you have to include examples. If you don't include examples, you come across like you're just trying to move past the question. You have to sink into the question, live in it, share something really personal. And if you do that and you keep your responses to probably should be about 3 minutes. If you do that, you're going to present yourself in the right light.
I like STAR with a double R. Results and reflection.
Oh, I like that.
So what would you do differently if you were implementing the same change initiative or program? How would you go about it in a different way, or how did it work? I think that shows some real insights into the way that we may have that self-reflection time at the end of every day or at the end of significant change programs or periods. STAR, double R.
I like STAR with a double R. I think just one last piece of advice for our listeners too, Teagan, is it's okay to not know, right? Oftentimes we get caught up in an interview and we think we have to know all the answers, but we don't. And my best piece of advice is before you start responding to any question, take a breath. Pause. It might seem like eternity to you, but for the panel, all they're saying is you're taking a breath, collecting your thoughts, and then responding. Just take a moment to pause, think for a microsecond, and then start your answer.
It's funny you talk about the pause, Adrian. I've just spent some time with our potential prefects going through the application process for next year, working through some common interview tips. And that was one of my tips around pausing. I think some of them may have taken me too literally, because I think there was about a minute pause yesterday, but they were very considered.
For principal roles, that's a bit too long. That was the other thing I was thinking too, Teagan. When I said it's okay to not know, it is actually okay to not know. So if you're caught by surprise by a question and you're feeling as though you can't respond, you can say, I can't really think of an appropriate answer right now, but what I can say is this, right? So bringing in some of our media training perhaps and pivoting the question into something where you can answer. Now, some might view that as you didn't answer the question, but others will see you being able to think on your feet and to be able to move it into a direction where you're comfortable speaking. So I think that is a valid interview technique as well. Be careful of your mannerisms is another tip. And we all have them. We all have them. And some of them are blind spots for us. We don't know we're doing it. Limit the ums and the ahs. Be really confident. Make sure your body language is appropriate for the situation. Make sure you're speaking clearly, maintaining eye contact. All those things that we take for granted, but in the heat of the moment when you're really nervous, sometimes you can forget about.
They matter.
They do matter.
So you've had the first interview, we've got the second interview call up, and sometimes with principal processes that may involve a time where you need to present on something. What's been your experience with that?
Typically, if you get past the first round panel interview with the board, it does become a little bit more relaxed because then they become more interested in you as the person. Are you the right cultural fit for the school? Are you aligned with the board in terms of vision and direction? You might be asked to respond to a scenario or to give a presentation. In my interview, I was asked to give a presentation. I think it was the second round with the board, and I was asked to prepare my vision for the school over the next 10 to 15 years. And so that's a pretty broad scenario to consider. But I think what they were looking for is they're looking for someone who had an understanding of the school, someone who'd done their research, someone who could articulate what that vision might be so that they could get a sense if you could bring that community along with you behind that vision. Now, typically that presentation could be 15 to 20 minutes. It could be 30 minutes, depending upon the scenario or the context. And then there'd be Q&A. It's an opportunity for you to shine, to show the panel that you've really done your research and that you've got a vision for the school if you were to be the next principal, which is absolutely an integral part of being a principal, having a vision.
You made a great point about fit. As part of my network and programs that I'm involved in with many colleagues who are in the process of applying for principalships, we know that gaining that first principalship can be the toughest. And I think part of that, and I may have to take my own advice on when I'm ready for this and start going through this process, is that when you make it to that interview phase, there's no question that you can do the job. It's all about fit. But it does become really tough at the top when the board may be interviewing 4 or 5 people in that first round or in the second round that all could do the job, but it really does come down to fit. And I know a couple of members of executive teams that I've worked with in the past who have been going through principal applications for 12 months, 18 months, same with many aspirant principals, and it can be really deflating. But I look at some of them now who are leading Australian principals. And it was just about the board who was going to take the chance on them as the first-time principal, getting their feet under the desk of the right school with the right community so that they could really thrive.
There are some things you can control and there are some things that you can't. When you're preparing for your first principalship and your application, if you can focus on making sure that everything that's in your control is done to the highest possible standard, your preparation, your interview, that's all within your sphere. What you're talking about is the things that you can't control. And it is deflating if you receive some feedback around, we just decided to go in a different direction because we didn't think the fit was right. But in many ways, I'm a big believer of things happen for a reason. They might have actually done you a favour by not appointing you as principal in that school because for whatever reason, given their experience and insight, they saw something that just wasn't right. Or they thought you were too progressive. Whatever the reason is, I think it's okay. It doesn't make it any easier to deal with, but you just pick yourself back up and you go again. It's not personal. You keep applying and eventually you'll find the right school with persistence and resilience. You do invest a lot of energy and time into an application for becoming a principal in a school and also a lot of emotional energy.
So we've been offered the job. We've got the contract. Some principals would say you absolutely must have the contract reviewed by a school's lawyer that you can pay for and employ to review the contract and make sure remuneration's at standard, it's benchmarked appropriately, the right professional learning clauses are in there, there's no little asterisks that can get you into hot water, or you sign on the dotted line. What do?
I had someone view my contract for the first time. I think that's the right thing to do for your first principalship. After you become a principal and you're immersed in that space and you're working with executive contracts and you know the lay of the land, for your second principalship you wouldn't need that because it costs a couple of $1,000s to have someone review it. But I thought that was money well spent just in terms of providing me with some guarantees and some assurances. There is another piece to this, Teagan. You get your contract and there's a remuneration package included as part of that contract. And are you happy with it? Do you want to go back to the board and negotiate? And that can be an interesting experience. You have to do it respectfully. It can be viewed in a negative way by some boards or by some chairs. But on the flip side to that, if you do negotiate, you could get a better deal for yourself. And why wouldn't you do that? The other thing to consider before you sign on that dotted line, you are entitled to look at some financial statements at that point of the process. You want to make sure that the school's financially healthy. If they do carry debt, can they service that debt? Is enrollment stable? If you've got any doubts, that's the time to start asking those questions because they will provide you with that information. And depending upon what you find, that could be then a conversation with the chair, with the recruiter that could influence your decision. You just want to make sure you do your due diligence and you sign on the dotted line. What a moment, right? You've just landed your first principal job, really exciting. And then I guess the reality sets in, right? Depending upon the length of time that you have remaining in your current workplace, you need to make sure that you finish well in whatever role it is that you currently have. But it's really difficult because your mind is automatically going to your next job and people will start contacting you. They'll introduce themselves. You'll need to go and spend days at the school, get introduced to the new community, which is all lovely, but it is a distraction from finishing the current job well. But that's all part and parcel of it.
Do you remember your first day as principal?
I actually don't. Is that bad?
Put you on the spot there. Or maybe that's a good thing.
Might be a good thing. I don't know. I think that first 12 months in particular was a blur. I'll say that for sure. We did some great work building our team as we navigated through that first year. Teagan, you'd started with me as deputy principal or now associate principal at the same time. We were navigating that new path together, which was a great experience.
In closing our episode today, is there anything that stands out that you could have done to be better prepared or that you think, I wish I did that?
I think some of my previous experiences prior to becoming a principal had set me up for success. The one thing that I was not prepared for, which I think is quite common, is just the sheer enormity and volume of things that come into the principal's office. And a lot of times you have to just get used to that. It's being able to go from the strategic to the operational, from the macro to the micro, and do that 100 times a day for different aspects across the school, but you do get used to it. But it's also about realigning expectations because when you start as a principal, the culture of the school, people's expectations are very much aligned to your predecessor and their preferred ways of working. You have to be okay with operating in that space for a little bit before you realign people's expectations around how you actually want to work. So that's probably the thing that I think about when I look back that I wasn't prepared for. But at the same time, you've just got your first principalship. So you've got lots of energy, lots of enthusiasm, lots of motivation, so you're just in there and you're just doing it. Now, the only advice I've got to people is just be authentic. Goes back to where we started at the start of the episode. Be authentic, be true to yourself. Don't try and be someone you're not, because that won't end well for you.
I've really enjoyed our conversation today, and I hope our listeners have found practical tips as well as thought-provoking and reflective, because it is a big step and it's the best job in the world.
It is, and let's not lose sight of that.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Teagan. That's a wrap on today's episode of The Principal's Perspective. We hope this conversation gave you practical insights to lead with clarity, confidence, and impact.
Leadership is a continuous journey, and we'd love to keep the conversation going. You can find us on LinkedIn. Just search for Dr. Adrian Camm and Teagan Collins and let us know your thoughts, questions, or leadership wins.
Make sure to follow The Principal's Perspective on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if today's episode resonated with you, share it with someone in your network.
Until next time, keep leading with purpose, and we'll see you in the next episode. You can be sure to find any references, books, or resources we discussed today in the show notes. Please jump on into the comments and join the conversation.